Hello everyone. I'd like, first of all, to thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to share our work here today. We are from Universiti Malaysia Sabah and we present to you vocabulary learning strategies preferences among the post-UPSR learners. This paper is CO written by Wardatul Akmam Din, DG Nursiswani Dud, Narani Said and Suyansa Swanto. Introduction. This study aimed to identify the extent to which vocabulary learning strategies influence the results of English writing in UPSR of the post-UPSR learners. The subjects were 267 high achievers Form 1 learners from 4 secondary schools who had completed the UPSR in Kota Kinabalu, Sabah. The purpose of this study was to determine which vocabulary learning strategies, VLSs, was used the most frequently by the post-UPSR learners. Literature review. Recent research has shown that different learners have different learning styles. Beacon and Nakar, 2007, Hughes, Breckler, Jaun and NGO, 2009, Follis and Peel, 2009, Bhagat, Vyas and Singh, 2015. Learning strategies refer to the technique by which learners can efficiently grow their knowledge both inside and outside of school if they have skills that initiate, guide, and control the search for information, as well as its subsequent processing and storage. Wegner, Menard and Streck, 2013. Plus, learners are required to demonstrate greater autonomy and effort in learning processes, such as examining learning materials and able to comprehend content. Vocabulary is critical in the acquisition of the English language, particularly for second language learners. A broad vocabulary is an important tool in a writer's toolkit, alongside punctuation, grammar, and a variety of other skills. The study of Normazita, Ku, and Hazita, 2012, summarized two critical issues in Malaysian English language learning. For starters, the interference of the mother tongue language system, namely Bahasa Malaysia, appears to result in incorrect application of English grammatical rules, morphology, and syntax. When writing in English, learners constantly use their first language, direct translation as well as dictionary definitions to understand English text. Gabul, Maria Das, and Kashef, 2012, on the other hand, conducted research on Malaysian writing problems at the secondary school level, analyzing essays to determine how many errors they made based on three related aspects: conventions, punctuation, and language use. The results showed that the learners could use synonyms/antonyms and correct grammatical structures, but they struggled to use appropriate language and frequently used L1 words and Bahasa Malaysia sentence patterns in their writings. Furthermore, the study reveals that learners can use SVO, subject and verb and object, SP, subject and predicate, and SVA, subject and verb and adverbial, patterns with minimal errors. To sum it up, Malaysian learners need help with basic vocabulary and grammatical structure. Methodology. This quantitative study centralized on analyzing the VLSs most employed by the post-UPSR high achievers in Sabah. The quantitative research seeks to analyze the most preferred strategies of vocabulary learning. Research participant. The researchers selected 4 secondary schools by fixating on learners who received A on the UPSR English writing examination, particularly those from the best schools in Kota Kinabalu. To collect information, a questionnaire was used as the instrument of the study. There are Likert scale close format question items about the VLSQ, and an open format question asking if the learners have used any other VLSs that were not included in the questionnaire. These questionnaires were distributed to 267 Form 1 high achiever learners. The VLSQ, which consists of 44 items, was adapted from ALJD, AA. 2011, whose taxonomy is primarily based on Schmidt's 1997 VLS taxonomy, which was organized based on Oxford's 1990 social, memory, cognitive, and metacognitive categories. Schmidt's taxonomy includes 58 VLS that are divided into two categories: discovery strategies, useful for the initial discovery of a word's meaning, and consolidation strategies, useful for remembering that word once it has been introduced. These strategies are further classified into 5 categories, with the discovery category including determination and social strategies, and the consolidation category including social, memory, cognitive, and metacognitive strategies. The analysis for determination strategy is shown in the table. For the strategy, identify the part of speech of the new word to know its meaning. Majority of the learners sometimes use the strategy, 36.1%. For the strategy, break the new word up into the main parts. Majority of the learners, 32.0%, rarely use the strategy. For the strategy, check for Malay words that are similar in form and meaning to the new word. Most of the learners, 27.9%, usually use the strategy. For the strategy, analyze any available pictures to understand new words. Majority of the learners, 31.3%, sometimes use the strategy. For the strategy, analyze any available gestures to understand new words. Majority of the learners, 27.9%, rarely use the strategy. For the strategy, use a bilingual dictionary, English/Malay. Most of the learners, 38.1%, always use the strategy. For the strategy, use a bilingual dictionary, Malay/English. Majority of the learners, 38.8%, always use the strategy. For the strategy, use a monolingual dictionary, English/English. Most of the learners, 27.2%, sometimes use the strategy. Finally, for the strategy, guess the meaning of the new word from the context in which it occurs. Majority of the learners, 32%, sometimes use the strategy. The analysis for social strategies is shown in the table. For the strategy, ask teacher for translation of the new word into Malay. Majority of the learners, 29.3%, usually use the strategy. For the strategy, ask teacher for a paraphrase of the new word. Majority of the learners, 30.6%, sometimes use the strategy. For the strategy, ask teacher for a sentence including the new word. Most learners, 31.3%, sometimes use the strategy. For the strategy, ask teacher for the word lists used whether they are accurate. Most learners, 25.9%, sometimes use the strategy. For the strategy, ask classmates for the meaning of the new word. Most learners, 34.0%, usually use the strategy. For the strategy, discover new meanings through group work activity. Most learners, 36.1%, sometimes use the strategy. Finally, for the strategy, study and practice meaning of the new words in a group of learners. Most learners, 31.3%, sometimes use the strategy. The analysis for memory strategies is shown in the table. For the strategy, make a picture in mind of the new word's meaning. Most learners with the same proportion, 29.3%, usually and always use the strategy. For the strategy, study the spelling of the new word. Most learners, 42.2%, always use the strategy. For the strategy, study the part of speech of the new word to remember it. Most learners, 29.3%, sometimes use the strategy. For the strategy, connect the new word to a personal experience. Most learners, 32.7%, usually use the strategy. For the strategy, paraphrase the meaning of the word in another way. Most learners, 34.7%, sometimes use the strategy. For the strategy, study the sound of the new word. Most learners, 29.9%, usually use the strategy. For the strategy, associate the new word with its coordinates. Most learners, 23.8%, never use the strategy. For the strategy, say the new word aloud when studying. Most learners, 27.2%, sometimes use the strategy. Next, for the strategy, connect the new word to its synonyms and antonyms. Most learners, 26.5%, usually use the strategy. For the strategy, learn the words of an idiom together. Most learners, 33.3%, sometimes use this strategy. Finally, for the strategy, make an image in mind of the form of the new word. Most learners, 29.9%, sometimes use this strategy. The table above shows the frequency and percentage for cognitive strategies based on all responses. For the strategy, repeat the new word over and over. Most learners, 32.0%, sometimes use the strategy. For the strategy, write the new word many times. Most learners, 29.9%, rarely use the strategy. Finally, for the strategy, make own lists of new words. Most learners, 24.5%, sometimes use the strategy. The table above shows the frequency and percentage for metacognitive strategies based on all responses. For the strategy, watching English TV channels, most learners, 63.9%, always use the strategy. For the strategy, using computer programs, most learners, 52.4%, always use the strategy. For the strategy, listening to English radio programs, most learners, 48.3%, always use the strategy. For the strategy, reading English newspapers and magazines, most learners, 25.9%, always use the strategy. For the strategy, revise the newly learned words soon after the lesson session. Most learners, 32.0%, usually use the strategy. For the strategy, continue to review the word over time. Most learners, 40.1%, sometimes use the strategy. For the strategy, revise the newly learned words using spaced repetition. Most learners, 26.5%, both sometimes and usually use the strategy. For the strategy, skip the new word. Most learners, 32.7%, both never and rarely use the strategy. Finally, for the strategy, try to assess own vocabulary knowledge. Most learners, 36.1%, sometimes use the strategy. This study presumed that the high achiever post-UPSR learners were aware of their vocabulary learning strategy preferences. The results of the study were identified and based on each category in the analysis of the questionnaire. As recommendations of the study, it is critical to focus on the learning strategies used by high achiever language learners during their primary school years in order to increase learning strategy knowledge and competency for other primary school learners. The VLSs used by the high achiever learners in this study could provide substantial evidence for other learners, allowing them to set a better phase of learning for themselves in achieving beneficial and better English learning, particularly in improving their skills of writing. Learners who received an A on the UPSR English writing examination should be aware of what strategies work best for themselves in learning English. In a nutshell, the learners' learning strategies in this study could serve as a model for other language learners pursuing the learning objectives. Thank you.